You walk into what looks like a normal plantation parlor in 1845 Alabama, but behind the silk curtains and crystal chandeliers, you discover something so bizarre, so utterly depraved, that it shatters every assumption you've ever made about the limits of human degradation. A wealthy cotton planter who didn't just abuse his power over enslaved people. He used his own wife's obesity as entertainment, forcing her into sexual situations with a dwarf slave, while plantation guests watched and wagered on the spectacle. What drives a man to transform his own marriage into a circus of humiliation? What kind of monster turns his wife's body into a public exhibition for the amusement of other wealthy perverts? This is the story of Beauregard Ashworth, the man who built his social reputation on the most twisted form of entertainment imaginable. A spectacle so depraved that even hardened slaveholders were sickened. A secret so shameful that 4 generations tried to erase it from history. What he did to his wife and that innocent slave will make you question everything you think you know about the depths of human cruelty. And what happened when his guests finally refused to participate will prove that some entertainment is too vile, even for the most corrupt souls. So ask yourself this: how far would you go to maintain your social status among the wealthy elite? Because Beauregard's answer will haunt your conscience forever. Summer 1845, Magnolia Heights Plantation, Montgomery County, Alabama. Beauregard Ashworth owned 2,200 acres of prime cotton land and operated what appeared to be one of the most sophisticated entertainment venues in the state. But his reputation wasn't built on elegant dinner parties or refined cultural events. It was built on human degradation orchestrated through methods so twisted that even the most jaded plantation owners whispered about them in horrified fascination. Beauregard was 48 years old, a tall, gaunt man whose aristocratic features masked a mind that had long ago abandoned any pretense of human decency. He had married Cordelia Hartwell in 1820, a union that combined 2 of Alabama's wealthiest planting families. What should have been a partnership of equals became the foundation for the most psychologically destructive form of entertainment in Southern history. Cordelia was the key to everything. Now 43 years old and weighing nearly 400 pounds, she had once been considered one of the most beautiful women in Montgomery society. But years of compulsive eating, triggered by her husband's increasingly bizarre demands and psychological abuse, had transformed her into something Beauregard saw not as his wife, but as the centerpiece of his twisted entertainment empire. The plantation's official records showed 156 slaves, but the real story was in the special quarters Beauregard had constructed behind the main house. These weren't typical slave cabins, but elaborate viewing rooms and performance spaces designed to accommodate the wealthy guests who traveled from across the South to witness Beauregard's unique form of entertainment. What made Beauregard's operation unique wasn't just the scale of the degradation. It was the methodology. While other wealthy planters might privately abuse their slaves or humiliate their wives, Beauregard had created a systematic form of entertainment that combined both cruelties into a single, profitable spectacle. The centerpiece of his operation was a slave named Moses, a dwarf who stood barely 4 feet tall, but possessed what Beauregard described in letters to potential guests as unusual physical proportions that made him ideal for the plantation's special entertainment needs. Moses had been purchased specifically for this purpose from a slave dealer who specialized in what were euphemistically called exotic specimens. The entertainment program operated with the efficiency of a well-run theater. Beauregard would invite select guests from across the plantation elite, men who shared his appetite for degradation and were willing to pay substantial sums to witness spectacles that existed nowhere else in civilized society. These weren't casual social gatherings, but carefully orchestrated events that generated enormous profits while destroying everyone involved. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this system was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Beauregard had convinced Cordelia that her participation was necessary to maintain their social standing and financial security. He framed her humiliation as a wife's duty to support her husband's business ventures and their responsibility to entertain important guests. For Moses, Beauregard used a combination of rewards and punishments that kept him compliant while destroying his spirit. Cooperation brought better food, clothing, and living conditions. Resistance faced brutal punishment or threats of sale to plantations where survival was measured in months rather than years. The most insidious aspect of the program was how it corrupted everyone it touched. Cordelia was transformed from a dignified plantation mistress into a public spectacle who had learned to perform degrading acts for the entertainment of strangers. Moses was forced to participate in activities that violated every aspect of human dignity while pretending to enjoy the experience for the amusement of wealthy perverts. The guests themselves became accomplices in a form of entertainment that pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even within the brutal context of slavery. They weren't just witnessing abuse, they were actively participating in and financing the systematic destruction of human dignity for their own twisted pleasure. The economic success of these entertainment events was undeniable. Beauregard's annual income from his special guests exceeded the profits from cotton production, making him one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Alabama. He used this wealth to expand his entertainment facilities, purchase additional specialty slaves, and bribe officials to ignore uncomfortable questions about his methods. But maintaining the operation required increasing levels of psychological violence and control. As Cordelia's mental state deteriorated and Moses showed signs of complete psychological breakdown, the system became harder to manage. Some guests began expressing discomfort with the extreme nature of the entertainment. Several prominent families quietly stopped accepting invitations to Magnolia Heights. The breaking point came in August 1845 when a new guest, Colonel Harrison Blackwood from South Carolina, attended one of Beauregard's entertainment events, expecting the kind of refined debauchery common among wealthy planters. Instead, he witnessed a spectacle so depraved that it challenged his understanding of acceptable behavior even within the context of slavery. Blackwood's reaction created a crisis that Beauregard hadn't anticipated. Instead of quietly expressing discomfort or simply declining future invitations, Blackwood began talking to other plantation owners about what he had witnessed at Magnolia Heights, spreading information that Beauregard had worked for years to contain within his trusted circle of regular guests. Blackwood's revelations created unrest throughout Alabama's planting elite. As people began to understand the full scope of Beauregard's operations, longtime guests realized they had been participating in activities that crossed lines even they found abhorrent. Social leaders who had previously enjoyed Beauregard's hospitality suddenly found themselves associated with entertainment so twisted that it threatened their own reputations. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. The plantation elite had always known that sexual abuse and degradation were common aspects of slavery, but the discovery of systematic profit-driven entertainment involving a planter's own wife created a level of horror that transcended ordinary cruelty. Beauregard's response to the exposure was typically calculated and brutal. He attempted to silence Blackwood through threats and bribery, increased security around his entertainment facilities, and began spreading counter-rumors about Blackwood's own moral character. Most importantly, he accelerated his entertainment schedule, trying to maximize profits before potential interference from outside authorities. But Blackwood's revelations had set in motion events that Beauregard couldn't control through intimidation alone. Word of Magnolia Heights operations began spreading beyond Alabama's plantation elite through the network of business connections, political relationships, and social ties that connected Southern society. The exposure came through an unlikely source, a Methodist circuit preacher named Reverend Samuel Mitchell, who had been providing religious services to various plantations throughout Montgomery County. Mitchell had noticed unusual patterns in the behavior and mental state of slaves at Magnolia Heights, particularly the extreme psychological distress exhibited by Moses and several other slaves who had been forced to participate in Beauregard's entertainment program. Mitchell's investigation began as a pastoral concern for the spiritual welfare of slaves who seemed to be suffering from more than ordinary plantation brutality. But as he spoke with more people and gathered more information, he began to suspect that something far more sinister was occurring at Magnolia Heights than typical slave abuse. The breakthrough came when Mitchell gained the trust of an elderly house slave named Charity, who had worked at Magnolia Heights for 20 years and had witnessed the evolution of Beauregard's entertainment program from its beginning. program from its beginning. Charity provided Mitchell with detailed information about the operation, including the location of special facilities and the names of regular guests who participated in the entertainment. Armed with this information, Mitchell felt compelled to act despite the personal and professional risks involved. Exposing a prominent plantation family would destroy his ministry and potentially endanger his life, but he believed the crimes being committed at Magnolia Heights were too serious to ignore. Mitchell's solution was to document everything carefully and present his findings to religious and civil authorities, simultaneously making it impossible for Beauregard to suppress the information through bribery or intimidation. He spent months gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The explosion of scandal that followed Mitchell's revelations destroyed not just Beauregard Ashworth, but the entire social structure of Montgomery County. The idea that a respected planter had been operating what was essentially a human degradation theater, using his own wife and enslaved people as performers, challenged fundamental assumptions about Southern society, family values, and the limits of acceptable behavior, even within the context of slavery. The reaction from other plantation owners was particularly intense. While most were certainly guilty of sexual abuse and degradation of enslaved people, the systematic nature of Beauregard's operation and his use of his own wife as entertainment crossed lines that even hardened slaveholders found abhorrent. He had turned what was usually private abuse into a public spectacle that treated human dignity like a commodity. Local religious leaders were equally horrified, not just by the sexual crimes, but by the perversion of marriage relationships and social responsibilities that Beauregard's program represented. The idea that a husband would systematically exploit and humiliate his own wife for profit challenged Christian concepts of marriage, family, and human dignity. The legal response was complicated by the fact that most of Beauregard's actions were technically legal under Alabama law. The husbands had broad authority over their wives, and slave owners had even broader authority over their property. The involvement of paying guests complicated matters, but prosecutors struggled to identify specific charges that would stand up in court. The social response was more immediate and devastating. Beauregard found himself completely ostracized from polite society, with former friends and business associates refusing to acknowledge his existence. Cordelia, despite being a victim of his abuse, faced similar treatment as society blamed her for participating in activities that challenged conventional morality. But the most significant response came from the enslaved community itself. The exposure of Magnolia Heights operations created a wave of resistance and unrest that spread throughout the region as enslaved people realized that even the most powerful masters could be held accountable for their crimes. The final resolution of the Magnolia Heights scandal came not through legal proceedings, but through economic and social pressure that made continued operation impossible. Beauregard was forced to sell the plantation and most of his slaves to pay debts and legal fees, effectively ending his entertainment program and scattering the evidence of his crimes. The fate of the key participants varied dramatically. Cordelia was sent to live with distant relatives in Tennessee, where she died within 2 years, apparently from complications related to her obesity and psychological trauma. Moses disappeared into the general slave population when the plantation was sold, with no records of his subsequent fate. Beauregard himself lived for another decade after the scandal, but as a broken and impoverished man who had lost everything he had built through years of calculated cruelty. He died in 1855 in a boarding house in Mobile, his funeral attended by no one except the minister who performed the service out of Christian duty. The slaves who had suffered under his entertainment program faced their own challenges in the aftermath of the scandal. Many were sold to distant plantations where their psychological trauma wasn't understood or treated, condemning them to lives of continued suffering. The special facilities at Magnolia Heights were demolished, and the property was eventually sold to a family that had no knowledge of its twisted history. The broader impact of the Magnolia Heights scandal extended far beyond Montgomery County, contributing to growing tensions within Southern society about the limits of acceptable behavior and the moral costs of absolute power. The story highlighted the particular vulnerability of both enslaved people and women within systems that granted unlimited authority to white men. Today, The site of Magnolia Heights plantation is marked only by some overgrown foundations and a historical marker that makes no mention of the entertainment program or the scandal that destroyed the Ashworth family. The official history of Montgomery County glosses over the events of 1845, treating them as an unfortunate aberration rather than a window into the systematic cruelty that absolute power made possible. But in the oral traditions of families throughout Alabama and beyond, the story of Beauregard Ashworth and his twisted entertainment empire lives on as a reminder of the particular horrors that unchecked power can create and the courage required to expose crimes that powerful people want to keep The story serves as a testament to the power of moral courage to destroy even the most carefully protected systems of abuse, demonstrating that no crime is so well hidden or so protected by wealth and power that it cannot eventually be exposed and punished. It also reminds us that resistance can take many forms, from Blackwood's moral revulsion to Mitchell's investigative courage. Most importantly, the Magnolia Heights scandal illustrates how absolute power corrupts absolutely, transforming husbands into pimps, wives into performers, and human relationships into entertainment commodities. Beauregard Ashworth didn't just own slaves and control his wife. He owned their dignity, selling their humanity for the amusement of perverts who paid premium prices for the privilege of witnessing ultimate degradation. The man who thought he had created the perfect system of profitable entertainment discovered that perfect evil carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And the people he treated as props in his twisted theater proved that even the most powerless individuals can find ways to expose truth and claim justice when moral courage meets opportunity. In the end, Beauregard Ashworth's greatest crime wasn't just the systematic degradation of enslaved people and his own wife. It was the perversion of hospitality itself, the transformation of Southern social traditions into weapons of exploitation that destroyed both his victims and his own standing in pursuit of profits that ultimately meant nothing. The secret of Alabama's most depraved plantation was finally buried with its architect, but the lessons it teaches about the corrupting power of absolute authority and the resilience of human dignity in the face of ultimate degradation remain as relevant today as they were in 1845.